The ever-dangerous game of thread chicken. I'm almost done, but so is this thread. Stay tuned to find out who wins. Hello everyone, and welcome to my sewing studio. Today I'm finally going to be finishing my corset! Yay! Although this is only my first iteration of the corset, so I do plan on making another. And this one is kind of a practice corset so that I can make sure that the fit is really good, because my previous mock-up was simply quilting cotton, and so while I could get the basic fit figured out with that, it's not the same as the thick denim that I used for this corset, which is similar to the twill I'm using for the final corset. My hope with this corset is to be able to wear it, so I wanted it to be fully functional, and then see if there's any pressure points that are causing pain or discomfort, see if there are any other fit issues, and then modify the pattern before I go into my final corset. So for my fabric, I am using a pair of jeans that I thrifted, and I'm going to put all of the pattern pieces on one leg for one side of the corset and the other leg for the other side of the corset. So I should have a mirror image of each pattern piece. This is the layout that I used. I first traced the outline of each pattern piece in a black ink. These are all heat erasable. And I traced the seam allowance in a white ink so that I could see it better to cut it out. The top and bottom of the corset, I left a 1/2 inch seam allowance just because I wasn't sure exactly where I wanted the curve of the top to be, and an inch seam allowance on the sides so that I would have room to do French seams for the boning channels. The reason that I'm doing French seams is that I read in a blog that someone found the extant had been made with French seams for boning channels, and I was curious and wanted to try this out for myself. The busk that I bought didn't match the busk in the pattern exactly. It was slightly wider, so I had to trace around the busk first and then add the seam allowance to that piece. I then cut all the pieces out using my rotary cutter. For these two pieces, I carefully cut around the edges and then seam ripped in between them so that I could use the seam allowance from the jeans as part of the seam allowance for my corset. Unfortunately, when it came time to cut them, I miscut one and had to cut into a second pair of jeans that I had bought, but the color difference is so slight that you would only tell if you were really looking for it. To protect the busk from rust, if I ever need to wash this corset, I am spray painting it with this color of spray paint so that it kind of matches the jean hardware look that I'm going for. After the paint had dried, I marked the tabs on the piece that encases the busk so that I could sew around those slots, and then it could be inserted into the middle after the seam was sewn. for the peg side of the busk, I inserted the busk above the seam allowance so that the pegs would touch the jean side. I then used an awl to poke a hole and stretch the fabric out so that I could insert the peg into the fabric without having to cut it, to keep the integrity of the fabric intact. After that, I inserted the waist tape around the busk so that I could sew through the waist tape as I was sewing the busk in place. I then stitched around the busk using a zipper foot. Another new technique that I wanted to try on this corset was a way of pinning the two pieces of fabric together called roll pinning, and you can do it either with pins or with thread as I'm doing here, or even by ironing a fusible interfacing to another layer of fabric. The objective is for the two pieces of fabric to be joined together in a way that it wants to follow the curve instead of lay flat. Now, because I am cording these pieces, the roll pinning that I did actually got in the way, and I don't think it was able to make that curve the way that I wanted, simply because I had to move it before sewing. It was still a very fun technique to try, though. I did try both the thread and the pins. The pins were a little easier to work around when it came to inserting the cording, but not as easy when it came to handling the fabric, because I would often poke myself with the pins. The benefit of the pins was that I could scoot them out of the way, sew part of the cording, and then push the pins back in place. Because the roll pinning was in the way, I used a safety pin to insert the cording in between the two layers of fabric. But I feel like even that didn't quite give a significant difference to the shape. So although I tried it for one half of the panels, I ended up not using it on the other half. The hip panel required cording all the way from the top to the bottom edge, whereas the panels for the bust line and sides only had a few channels of cording on each one. I used a zipper foot to sew the cording down in place. I used a sticky note to mark the stitch line so that the cording would be lined up where I wanted it. For the pieces that I didn't roll pin, I was able to insert the cording more easily by simply lifting the fabric and sandwiching it between, pressing it in place, and then stitching. So I much preferred this method over trying to roll pin it, since it didn't seem to affect the panels and their curve anyway. Once I had the first line of stitching, I would insert a piece of cording, stitch against that, and then insert another piece of cording next to it. On each panel, I have 4 rows of cording, except for the back panel, which has 8. I followed the pattern pieces to determine where to put the cording, but because my cording is thicker, I only used 2 rows where they had marked 3. I pinned the denim pieces together and left the lining free so that I could lessen the bulk that is in each seam, and made sure that the lining was caught when I encased it in a French seam. I slightly offset each panel so that one panel would be sewn with 1/2 inch seam allowance and the other panel with 3/8, so that when I turned the seam, the longer side would end up as the top of the boning channel. I sewed the second and third panels together first, along with the 4th and 5th panels, before joining all 4 of them together. After all 4 panels were sewn together, I trimmed off the excess seam allowance with pinking shears so that as it followed the curve, it would have the same effect of clipping the curves. This would also help to prevent the fabric from fraying. Even though it was encased in a seam, I wanted to be very sure that it wouldn't fray. I have been struggling to figure out what to do at this point, because I know I want to add the waist tape, but it's attached to the front. I haven't sewn the front to the rest of the pieces yet, because I want to attach this piece, it goes this way, this piece to these first. But before I can attach this to here, I need all of these boning channels done. They look like that. This one I did to test. I really like how it turned out. However, the waist tape I want to be anchored at each of the boning channels. So I needed to figure out exactly where to anchor the waist tape, and then that leaves this piece loosely attached and possibly in the way of me sewing this on. So I have been hemming and hawing and researching and trying to figure out the best way to do this. I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave this one since it's done, but for the rest of them I'm going to tack it down into what will be this seam allowance, because I'm doing a French seam, so this will be encased. So this will then become the seam allowance like this is. So I want to tack the waist tape to the right point in this seam allowance, and then do the boning channels. But before I execute this plan, I need to iron all of the pieces so that my lining will lay flat and in place, and this also helps to set the stitches that I have already sewn. As I iron the denim side, I am using a pressing cloth, which is a scrap piece of linen that I had to keep the denim from getting scarred by the iron. I am pressing each seam the way that it should lay once the boning channel is created and then folded over. I have to be especially careful around the curves so that I will not lose the shape that goes around the bust. The first panel that I recorded went really well and all of the channels fit perfectly, but of course, as soon as I turned the camera on to film the second side, I had all sorts of problems. That actually happened a lot in this make, where I would film something, it wouldn't turn out right, and I'd have to unpick it, but since I already showed you the technique, I decided to just keep the footage and keep working. So some of the seams that you see may not line up exactly how they do in the final garment, but I have fixed them all. So now I'm anchoring the waist tape in each of the seam allowances that will be on the inside of the boning channel. After each of the French seams were done, I top stitch using the width of my zipper foot to determine how wide to make the boning channel, and a decorative golden thread so that it would resemble the top stitching used on modern jeans. Once I had finished the first side, I switched the presser foot so that the needle would be on the other side of the foot, and I could again follow that same area and create the second row of top stitching for the boning channel. Again here I had to be careful to not lose the curve of the seam so that it would hug the bust line. After all 4 pieces were together and the boning channels were complete, I could finally attach the hip panel. For this seam, I left all of the lining in on the top half, and I kept the lining for the hip panel out of the way so I could later use it to encase these raw edges. Now that all of the pieces of the main panels are together, I'm giving them a good press to make sure that they have the correct shape. I also trimmed down the excess seam allowance on the hip panel, this time using regular shears instead of pinking shears so that it would have a nice clean straight edge. And now I am pressing that seam into place so that it will lay nice and flat. But also using my tailor's ham to keep the curves of the corset intact as I press it. Once again using the linen pressing cloth to make sure that I don't scar the fabric. And now I'm finally sewing the bust panel into place with a top stitch to create a boning channel against the bust. I also have the lining moved out of the way of this so that I can do the same as the hip panel to encase the raw edges. After I trim the seam allowance down. Before adding the back panel to the rest of the corset, I needed to create boning channels and space for the grommets. I first sewed the denim and the lining right sides together along the edge. I pulled the lining taut after folding over the edge so that it wouldn't show on the outside of the corset. And then top stitched to create the boning channel on the very back of the corset. I then left space for the grommets before sewing another row of top stitching, and then pulled the waist tape into position so that I could catch it in the boning channel on the other side of the grommets. Before attaching the back panel to the rest of the corset, I added cording to that panel as well, and then stitched the back to the corset the way I had done the front. After all of the pieces were sewn together, I added bias tape to the bottom of the corset, trimmed the edges, and then folded it under to the lining side where I hand stitched it down. I adjusted the boning to fit the new boning channels the same way that I had originally cut them, with nail clippers rounding off the edges. I inserted each boning channel and then added bias tape to the top edge of the corset, which I finished in the same manner that I did the bottom. I didn't get footage of me setting these grommets. I used eyelet pliers to press them into place and then needed help hammering them with the die cast to get them to lay flush. In the future, I'd like to buy a grommet press. That way I'll be able to do it all in one step and on my own. loved how this first version of my corset turned out, and I'm excited to make the next one. But in the meantime, I've got a few other projects that I'm going to do to give me a break and give me time to see how the corset fits and see whatever changes I need to make before I go into the next corset. Some feedback I do have about the way I made this corset. I wanted to try French seams for the bone casing instead of having bone casing sewn into the corset or the seam allowance just folded to one side and then use that as a boning channel as is typically done. It didn't turn out the way that I'd hoped. Like, it was, the channels themselves look really good. I like that part. What's hard about that is getting the seam lines perfect, because you have to get exactly the right amount away from the seam line when you sew the first seam, because you're basically finishing the seam first and then closing it off with the seam line, if that makes sense. I ended up having excess seam allowance in some places, more narrow seam allowance in other places, and then somehow 2 of my panels ended up like half an inch off. I caught one in time to fix it, but one of the back panels, one side actually is bigger than the other. So I don't think that's affecting the fit too much because it's just going, like, taking away from the lacing gap. So I think other than that, the fit is pretty good, but I would not recommend using French seams for boning channels. I think in the future I'll just fold over the seam allowance and sew it to one side to create the boning channel in the same place that it would have been on the original corset without having the French seams. Overall, this was a really fun project, and I really love how this version of my corset turned out, and I'm excited to wear it with some history bounding outfits, mix and match some modern clothes with it, and shape my clothes to fit well over this corset. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.